Hi there, everybody. I am going to be reading chapter 2 from the Landmark History of the American People. And this chapter is called The Nation Begins to Split. And you'll see that I have loaded pictures for you guys in your school classroom. But also, so you can follow along if you want to, or you can just listen. Okay? And then we're going to answer some questions as we go as well. So we will never know whether the South would have done its own job of house cleaning. Would it have abolished slavery on its own? We will never know because things were happening outside the South that made it hard for Southerners to keep their heads. After the Revolution, groups in northern cities formed clubs to fight slavery. They called themselves abolitionists, and that's a really important word, okay, that I want you to pay attention to. And so who were abolitionists? They were a people opposed to slavery. They published unpleasant stories about slavery and helped slaves run from slavery. This would be sort of like people against abortion nowadays, right? That they might publish documents and say, like, here's the really bad stuff that happens. So that's what an abolitionist is. And that's a really important word to remember. They collected lots of unpleasant stories about slavery and they published them in books, pamphlets, and magazines. They sent them all over the country. Of course, there were plenty of unpleasant stories to tell about the mistreatment of individual slaves, about the separation of black families. Theodore Dwight Weld, who was a New England minister, started his career on a crusade against alcohol. But then, inspired by English abolitionists, he began to fight slavery. In 1839, he published a book, and it was called Slavery as It Is, Testimony of 1,000 Witnesses. Now, just looking at that on your paper, how would you know that was a book and not a short story? And the answer is it's in italics, so you always put the titles of books in italics. So his book was called Slavery as It Is, Testimony of 1,000 Witnesses. He put the book together from items he had sifted from 20,000 newspapers. The book was a chamber of horrors. His purpose, he wrote, was to see the inside of that horrible system of oppression. In the advertisements for runaways, we detect the cruel whippings and shootings and brandings practiced on helpless slaves. Heart-sickening as the details are, I am thankful that God in his providence has put into our hands these weapons, prepared by the South itself to destroy the cruel monster. I actually myself think about slavery sometimes because we have a farm and I'm a farmer, and there are some days that I'm out there and it is so brutally hot. And I think to myself, what if somebody was making me be out here 12 hours a day and I didn't get any money for it? How would you motivate yourself to keep doing that? Nearly everybody likes to read horror stories. Well, I don't, actually. I don't. The book sold for only 37.5 cents a copy, and nearly everybody could afford one. There was a bargain price of $25 per 100 for people who wanted copies to give away. The book spread all over the North. Within the first 4 months, it sold 22,000 copies. Within a year, more than 100,000 were purchased. Northerners now began to get their picture of the South from Weld's book and from others like it. When Charles Dickens, the English novelist, wrote his book about America, he copied his stories about the South from Slavery as It Is. In Weld's book, Harriet Beecher Stowe found much of the ammunition for her own anti-slavery novel. While she was writing Uncle Tom's Cabin, she said, she used to sleep with Weld's book under her pillow. And I just recently read Uncle Tom's Cabin. It's a really fantastic book about a slave and sort of his runaway journey, and it was really, really outstanding. Uncle Tom's Cabin came out in March of 1852. The previous book had come out in 1839. In the story, a brutal slave dealer, Simon Legree, eventually flogs a Christ-like black man, Uncle Tom, to death because he won't give away the hiding place of 2 escaped slaves. The book quickly sold more than 100,000 sets of an expensive 2-volume edition. When it was published in a single cheap volume for 37.5 cents, it sold more than 300,000 copies within a year. It was made into plays and musical comedies. Uncle Tom's sideshows at fairs and circuses played up the most disturbing scene in the book. Sideshows were sort of like little acts, little plays that they would do off to the side. Like if you're at a circus, you might see it off to the side, like a little play. The escaped slave, Eliza, crosses a river by jumping from one chunk of ice to another while holding her baby in her arms. The plays would also enthrall audiences by having the saintly little Eva yanked up to heaven by pulleys. The book sold enormously in England. It was quickly translated into French, Italian, Dutch, Swedish, Danish, Flemish, Polish, and Magyar, which I've never heard of. There were more than 40 different German translations alone. Uncle Tom's Cabin became America's all-time worldwide bestseller. So we've got a timeline there on the bottom of our page, and you can check this out. In 1829, the governor of South Carolina basically condones slavery. Condones means says it's okay. He says slavery is not an evil. On the contrary, it is a national benefit. And then we've got Slavery as It Is, published in 1839. So within 10 years, we've got that book published. And then you look along there on the timeline. In 1852, we have Uncle Tom's Cabin published. And there's a picture in your book. Here's the picture in case you don't have the book with you or you don't have the picture pulled up. And for those of you who don't have a book that are reading along with me, you have copies of this. This is a hand-colored reproduction of a November 1856 wood engraving in the British humor magazine that was called Punch. Here's another word that's in italics, Punch. It's a newspaper. The agrarian South and merchant North look on as a black slave rips a map of the United States apart. What does it mean that the lack of unity between the states was a black business? That black slavery was ripping the country apart, that the breaking apart of the United States was an evil business, or both. On the page opposite of this engraving, a quote appeared attributed to Ralph Waldo Emerson, who was a famous poet during this time. He said, slaves, he was quoted as saying, are the black spots on the sun of American freedom. So definitely got a huge thing going on in our world with the slaves at this time. So Mr. Stowe gave one of the first copies of her to her congressman. Mrs. Stowe was Harry Beecher Stowe, who wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin. I'm back on the very bottom there. Your page doesn't actually have a page number, but it's actually page 9. She gave one of her first copies to her congressman as he was about to board the train for Washington. He started reading the book on the train. There's a picture up there of Eliza crossing the ice from Uncle Tom's Cabin. The story was so sad that he began to cry. He attracted the attention of the other passengers as he wiped the tears from his face and blew his nose. To avoid embarrassment, he got off the train at the next stop, where he rented a hotel room and sat up all night finishing the book. There, in the privacy of his room, he could weep to his heart's content. Many other people, too, reported that the book had upset them. There must have been thousands of tear-stained copies of Uncle Tom's Cabin. It is possible that without this book, Lincoln could never have been elected president, or may never have been elected president, I think it should say there. During the Civil War, Mrs. Stowe went to see President Lincoln. Is this the little woman whose book made such a great war? Lincoln had asked her. Many abolitionists were devout Christians. So the abolitionists are the people against slavery, don't forget, and they usually were Christians. Just like today, we see that most people fighting against abortion and against some other cruelties often are Christians or have a very devout faith. They believed that Jesus hated slavery. After all, he had preached that you should do unto others as you would have others do unto you. You do not want to be a slave yourself. What right, then, do you have to enslave others? Christianity, they said, was the religion of love, love for all your fellow men. The abolitionists wanted to preach love, but before very long, they were also preaching hate. It was easy enough to go from hating slavery to hating slave holders. And easy enough, too, to go from hating slave holders to hating all Southerners. So what they're saying is the abolitionists went from hating the fact that there was slavery to hating the people that were the slave owners to hating everyone in the South. And of course, we see that a little bit in our country today, where there's some prejudice against the South because of what had happened with slavery in the past. Since abolitionists were more interested in horror stories than in statistics, they did not advertise the fact that most white Southerners were not slaveholders. So remember, the majority of people don't own slaves. It's some big farms that own them. And that many slaveholders were not cruel. There were also slave owners that were kind people, albeit they had slaves. Their picture of the South had no bright spots in it. If there was any virtue in the South, why had not Southerners already abolished this monstrous evil for themselves? Beginning in the 1830s, a rising flood of abolitionist literature covered the country. It awakened Northerners to the evils of slavery. It made them hate slavery. It made them hate slaveholders. It also made them lump together all people in the South, as if all Southerners wanted slavery. As Northern propagandists, okay, and a propagandist is a person in the North that's giving propaganda and materials. Propaganda is sort of like pamphlets and preaching, often though, in written form. So as these Northern people are given their propaganda, they became more and more violent and more unreasonable. Southerners too became more and more unreasonable. As Northerners began to attack things about the South that were not really evil, Southerners replied by defending things about the South that were not really good. Instead of worrying about how to get rid of slavery, more Southerners began to worry about how to defend slavery and how to defend the South and themselves. They stopped apologizing for slavery. Indeed, instead of insisting that slavery was an unavoidable evil, more and more Southern defenders began to argue that slavery was valuable good. And this is where we had that quote on the previous page from the governor in 1829. Slavery is not an evil. On the contrary, it is a national benefit. A professor at the College of William and Mary in Virginia wrote an influential book putting together the best arguments in favor of slavery. Senator John C. Calhoun of South Carolina was one of the strongest proponents or supporters of slavery. He had been Secretary of the War under James Monroe. Then he served as Vice President of the United States. And now he had become the leading Southern thinker. Many in the South, he said, once believed that slavery was a moral and political evil. That folly is gone. We see it now in its true light and regard it as the most safe and stable basis for free institutions in the world. Many others supported Calhoun when he called slavery a positive good. Southern ministers said the Bible required that black people be slaves. Southern scientists said black people were an inferior race, the product of a separate creation that God made in the beginning on the African continent. Southern historians said that the glories of ancient Greece were possible only because the Greeks had a lot of slaves. And there you have a picture on the top there about idealized slavery as at one of the pro-slavery artists wanted it to be perceived. There's also a picture there on the right that's a little hard to see, and that's somebody who had escaped his master. He took refuge with the Union Army, and when they checked him out, they found his back like that from being whipped. And those are really hard things to see. It is really hard to see sad stuff in our world and to think that people supported it. You also have to remember that sometimes it takes a long time for the world to comprehend the evils. You know, just this last year, or not this last year, I think it was the year before, right? I think it was 2022 that we overturned we overturned something that had allowed abortion. Overturned something in the Supreme Court, right? Why did it take that long? Why were we doing that? And you have to remember that sometimes it takes a long time to see evil and to understand what to do with evil and to figure these things out. So we want to look back at history, right? And we want to look at it and we want to see what happened, but we also want to remember that you can't really judge what happened back then under the light of today, because we know a lot of different things today than we did then. So I hope that kind of explains that a little bit. This is a really good thing to have a conversation with your parents about too, about slavery. So we're on page 11 now. Otherwise, sane people wrote astonishing nonsense, all to show that slavery was the greatest thing that had ever happened to the human race. The most brilliant and most extreme of these defenders of slavery was a Virginia lawyer, George Fitzhugh. Having traveled through the North where he saw some miserable factory workers, Fitzhugh returned to the South a convinced pro-slavery man. In his book, and his book was called Cannibals All, or Slaves Without Masters, he went even further than those who only said that slavery was a positive good. According to him, any free society, that is, any society without slaves, was evil, precisely because it did not have slaves. Factory owners in the North were cannibals all. A cannibal is a person who eats humans, right? We don't have many cannibals left in our world, but there definitely are some cannibals. That is, they ate up the lives. So they aren't really cannibals in the traditional sense, but they ate up the lives of poor workers who labored long years and then were thrown away when old and sick. For all practical purposes, according to Fitzhugh, northern workers were slaves, but slaves without masters. Nobody was required to look after them or to see that they were fed and clothed. So what Fitzhugh is saying is, in the north, they had these factories. These factories have these workers that are paid, but they're really treated badly. They're basically the equivalent of a slave. So why not just have slaves, is sort of what he's saying. Slaves in the South, Fitzhugh said, were more fortunate than their northern peers. Southern slaves had masters. They had the best kind of social security. Whatever happened, it was not their worry. They did not have to pay any bills. They had no problem of unemployment. Slavery, as he described it, was a kind of socialism. Socialism is basically where everybody is making the same amount of money. Okay, sort of, not quite. Where all property was put into the hands of the people, but this is the white people, the best qualified to use it for the benefit of everybody, whites and blacks. 3 cheers for slavery, according to Fitzhugh. Southerners now showed they were just as clever as the Northerners in the great national competition in name-calling. When Northerners called all Southerners torturers and monsters in human form, Southerners answered by calling all Northerners cheating, stingy, money-grubbing Yankees. A Yankee, they said, was a man without a heart, or rather his heart was in his pocketbook. He understood nothing but money. A pamphlet that circulated in the South after 1832 told about a Yankee who was sent to hell. Now, this is a pamphlet, right? We don't really see very many pamphlets nowadays, but sometimes, if you walk into like one of the tourist centers when you're traveling with your parents and you walk in, you'll see all these like things you can choose. Those are pamphlets. Some are just 1 page, some are multiple pages. Okay, that's a pamphlet. So a pamphlet that circulated in the South after 1832. So you can look back on your timeline to see what was happening in 1832. We were still in between. We still hadn't had Uncle Tom's Cabin or the book Slavery as It Is, a collective of the horrifying events, published yet. So we're still kind of in the midst of it. Talked about a Yankee. A Yankee is a Northerner, okay? A Yankee who was sent to hell. Before letting the Yankee in, the devil put him on trial and accused him of numerous crimes. First crime was that he had cheated people by selling 497,000 plus wooden nutmegs, a bunch of cigars made of oak leaves, and wooden clocks with no works in them. He had also stolen an old grindstone, smeared it with butter, sold it as cheese. He had sold to a pious old woman a worn pair of shoes. The Yankee replied that in New England, where he came from, people considered these the cutest tricks. They had delighted his father. His father said they proved his son a genius. Even the devil was disgusted, and he said that Yankees were a bigger nuisance than all the rest of the world put together. Of course, both Northerners and Southerners were wrong when they said that all people in the other region were evil, but they were right when they said that the United States was being separated into 2 different countries. There were really many South. There was the Old South. That included 6 of the original states. And I'm going to have a map for you so you can look at this, okay? But, actually, I have a map for you. It's on page 12. Here it is, okay? So open that up right now while I'm reading this so you can see what I'm talking about. It's really good sometimes to have a visual reference, okay? So I'm on page 12. Included 6 of the original 13 states. So Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. So see those there? They're in blue. Okay, that was the Old South. Then there was a newer South of 9 other states where slavery was also permitted. Okay, so the newer South included Florida, 9 other states where slavery was also permitted. Well, it just has Florida there, so I'm not sure. Let me keep reading. Florida was a peculiar place. It had once belonged to Spain. It had lots of jungles and Everglades where Indian tribes still roamed. But the United States finally admitted it as a state in 1845. And in fact, a totally separate thing, because I grew up in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, at the very bottom of Florida. Florida really wasn't a very populated place until one amazing thing happened. Think about whether you can figure out what that would have been. What do you think would have changed Florida from a place that nobody wanted to live to a place where people were willing to live? What do you think? How about air conditioning? It's really true. Air conditioning allowed people to live in Florida because before that it was just too hot. They couldn't manage it. The other new southern states, which include Kentucky, okay, can you see that up there? Tennessee, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and Missouri, okay? Arkansas and Texas were as much west as south. So you see how that map right there, take a look at that map. It's got like a little chart. It's got a little key there, okay? And where you have the X's, that was sort of considered the West, which of course nowadays we don't consider that the West. The West is way over in the California side. Located on the western side of the Appalachian Mountains, or Appalachian, depending on where you're from, they looked away from the Atlantic Ocean. Their superhighway was the Mississippi River. They were the goal of many new settlers, and they had much of the Western spirit. The dignified old families of Virginia and the Carolinas looked down their noses at the crude backwoodsmen of Kentucky, Tennessee, and Alabama. In the Old South, gentlemen settled their quarrels by dueling under the traditional dueling oaks. Remember, where you would just turn and you'd fight with a sword or with a gun. In the newer South, life was far rougher. Men there were most likely to settle their quarrels by a free-for-all fight with Bowie knives. And if you look down there, it says Bowie knives, and there's a little 3 and a little 4. And that tells you to go down to your footnotes. Okay, so if you're interested, you can go down to your footnotes, and it tells you how to pronounce Bowie, okay, which is Bowie. You can also say it Bowie, they're saying. And it was a special design knife for fighting. So if you're interested about that knife, go ahead and read your footnote. Okay, I'm not going to go into it right now, but you can read about the knives. One thing drew all of these states together. It was not so much that they were Southern states, but that they were slave states. As Southerners began to boast of slavery, slavery began to dominate everything. To avoid the word slavery, which freedom-loving men everywhere hated, Southerners began to call it their peculiar institution. The peculiar institution was really making the South into a peculiar place. To keep our abolitionist books and magazines, Southern states, to keep out the abolition books and magazines, Southern states began stopping the United States mail. If a professor was suspected of not supporting slavery enthusiastically enough, he was fired. And we're seeing this in our society today, right? In some universities, in some places, where if you don't adhere to a certain doctrine, you might actually end up losing your job. To prevent slave uprisings, Southerners wanted to arm every white man. Military academies flourished, but other kinds of schools and colleges and universities did not. Southerners began to be afraid of their own shadow. If you did not proclaim the virtues of slavery, you were probably an enemy or a traitor. Southerners began to think they were a separate nation, which would stand or fall with slavery. Anyone who attacked slavery, they said, was attacking all the Southern people. Southerners became angrier and more passionate. Hate was brewing on all sides. Southerners began to shout, "Death to abolitionists." And in fact, you have a picture up there on the top of page 13 where pro-slavery mobs destroyed Lovejoy's press over and over again. Eventually, they set fire to the warehouse where his press was stored, and Lovejoy was shot dead. So, and you're going to hear about Lovejoy here in a second. And his name was Elijah Parrish Lovejoy. He was from New England, which is the North. He studied to be a Presbyterian minister. In 1833, he settled in Missouri. And you can see where Missouri is on your map, okay? There he began publishing a religious newspaper. He was a fanatic. He was against lots of things, including alcoholic drinks, the Catholic Church, and slavery. He wrote strong words in his newspaper, which he sent down the Mississippi from St. Louis, Missouri, to serve the cause of abolition. But Missouri itself was a slave state. In order to find a safer place for his newspaper, he moved 25 miles up the river to Illinois. You don't even have Illinois there on your map because it's out of the perceived South there, right? It's kind of up there above Kentucky. So he moved up into Illinois. Alton did not permit slavery, but the pro-slavery forces reached up over the border, and he was in for serious trouble. His press came up the river and arrived on the dock in Alton on a Sunday morning. In keeping with his religious principles, Lovejoy would not work on Sunday, and he would not make anyone else work on Sunday. So he left the press, and the press is something that is going to print the newspaper, okay? I'm going to put a little video of a press on there for you so you can see it. So there's going to be a little press there. That night, someone dumped it into the river. The decent citizens of Alton gave their own money to replace it, but pro-slavery mobs destroyed it again and again. And finally, on November 7, 1837, you can look back at your timeline to see about where we are here, right? So we're still not even where the books have been published yet. In 1837, word spread that the Ohio Anti-Slavery Society had sent Lovejoy another press, and it had just arrived. 60 young abolitionists, people who are against slavery, from nearby towns gathered to defend the press. Okay, so they come around and they're like, we're going to defend this. We're not going to let you destroy this press. Merchants expecting trouble closed their stores and begged Lovejoy to leave town. He refused, saying he preferred to be a martyr. And a martyr is someone who dies for a cause, right? Often for their faith. They are killed because of what they believe in. That night, there was a battle of the warehouse where Lovejoy's new press was stored. An armed mob of pro-slavery men gathered, but the abolitionist guard held them back. Then the pro-slavery forces began to set the warehouse on fire. When Lovejoy leaped out to prevent them, he was shot dead. For abolitionists everywhere, Elijah Parrish Lovejoy became a martyr. Pro-slavery men said he merely got what was coming to him. Both sides were collecting their heroes and martyrs. It was becoming harder and harder to imagine that the peoples of the North and the South could be kept within a single nation. And it isn't going to be possible, right? We're going to have a war. We're going to have a war over all this. So all of this is leading up to what's going to be the Civil War. So looking over some of our questions, remember I talked to you about what English abolitionists were. And we're going to see in the Wilberforce book that you're reading at the same time what's going to happen to slavery in the British area, what's going to happen to slavery. There's also a Bible passage that is quoted, and this is the golden rule, and I wanted to read this to you, Matthew 7:12. I'm sorry, I'm not going to read it to you, I'm just going to note it, Matthew 7:12. Christianity contributed much to abolishing slavery. As Alvin Schmidt writes in How Christianity Changed the World, both the abolition of slavery and rejection of racial segregation have their roots in the earliest teachings of Christ. The early Christians received slaves into church membership and often freed them when they could do so. Thus, the effort to remove slavery, whether it was Wilberforce in Britain or the abolitionists in America, was not a new phenomenon to Christianity. So what good came of all the abolitionist literature? What's another word for literature that we came up with? It was, now I'm drawing a blank. Not pamphlets. Literature, pamphlets. Oh, crud. What was the word? See if you can find it. Gosh, it's going to come to me. It's going to come to me what the word was that I just defined for you guys in here. Propaganda? Was it propaganda? Propaganda. That was the word I used. Okay. So what good came of all that literature? Well, it helped stirred up people against slavery. They got against slavery because they were seeing it all. Remember, we don't have the internet, right? So we can only know this stuff if we're seeing it in print. So it lumped all Southerners, though, into one group. It said all Southerners are bad. And of course, there were many Southerners that were against slavery or who didn't own slaves. What reason did some Southerners give for praising the value of slavery? So we talked about this a lot through the chapter, right? They would say that it was a national benefit, that successful nations like Greece had slaves, that Africans were a separate creation of God, that some scientists said that blacks were an inferior race, that slavery was kind of like a socialism, it helped take care of people. Okay, all of those things. What does the author say when he says there were really many Souths? How were they united? Okay, what is he saying when he says that? He's saying that there's different regions in the South. There's different regions, and you've got that on your picture. There is the Old South, the New South, and the Western and Backwoods South. They're all slave states, but they kind of have differing levels of how they feel about slavery. And what did the phrase peculiar institution refer to? It referred to slavery. So some important dates that I want you just to keep in mind is it was 1787 that the Northwest Ordinance forbid slavery northwest of the Ohio River. Okay, and while I don't see the Ohio River on that picture, I do see it if you wanted to look back on your picture of page 7, but I'm going to go ahead and hold this up to you guys. Okay, take a look at the screen right now. You see where the Ohio River is? Okay, everybody sees where the Ohio River is? It's right here. Okay, so there's the Ohio River. And it was in 1837. Sorry, wrong date. Totally wrong date. 1787 that it was banned there. Okay, so we're now talking like 60 years later, we've still got slavery in the South. It was 1807, okay, that we're now reading about Wilberforce, that we're going to get slavery banned everywhere in Britain. And it was 1834 I'm sorry, I should say that's when Britain started doing some of the stuff that Wilberforce is doing with outlawing aspects of slavery or trade. 1834, Britain is going to get rid of slavery altogether. And that is not on your timeline there on pages 8 and 9, but you can take a look at that. And then, so those are some important dates, okay? So, I want you to just give me something that really stood out to you in this chapter after you listen to it. There are so many things, and it can be a little hard to hear. So talk to your parent, I think. But see, this is where we don't want to erase history, because if we erase history, it could happen again, right? We want to know that this happened so we can prevent this from ever happening again or anything like it happening again in our world. And we really, of course, hope that it will. So just leave a comment about that. Otherwise, you are done with chapter 2 from this great book, The Landmark History of the American People.